Just 3 days after Trump left Beijing, Putin arrived hot on his heels. From May 19th to 20th, Russian President Putin made a state visit to China. The red carpet in Beijing has barely had a chance to cool down. His timing is no coincidence, it's entirely deliberate. It shows that the current international landscape is like a three-way standoff, with the Chinese Communist Party trying to play both sides between the US and Russia, hoping to benefit from both. At this moment, Putin has to go to Beijing in person to confirm whether the strategic lifeline that determines Russia's survival is still there. Let's look at the world together with Wei Yu. Hello everyone, I'm Chen Liu. Why is Putin in such a hurry to visit Beijing? What is his real purpose for coming to Beijing? As Xi Jinping tries to balance between the US and Russia, is he managing not to offend either side, or is he actually offending both? Some people might say, look, when Putin visited China, he was received at the airport by Wang Yi, a vice national level foreign minister, which is half a rank lower than when Trump visited and was received by Han Zheng, a vice premier at the national level. This suggests that Xi Jinping is intentionally favoring the US over Russia. But is that really the case? Let's first take a look at why Putin is in such a hurry to visit China. When it comes to the same events, Wei Yu's perspective on the world is always just a little bit different. If you want to know what Wei Yu thinks, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And if you don't see notifications for my shows, remember to check my homepage directly for the latest episodes. To understand why Putin is in such a rush, we first need to see what exactly Trump got out of his visit to Beijing. Judging from the list of achievements released by the US side, Trump gained quite a lot from this trip. In terms of trade and procurement, Trump said that China promised to purchase 200 Boeing commercial airplanes and 400 to 450 General Electric engines. If the initial deliveries go smoothly, the final order could reach 750 planes. He called it the largest airplane order in history. In addition, China also promised to buy soybeans and other agricultural products. Both China and the US agreed to establish a trade council and an investment council to promote the expansion of two-way trade under a framework of reciprocal tariff reductions. On the Iran issue, Trump said that Xi Jinping strongly agreed that Iran should never acquire nuclear weapons and that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to international shipping. Trump believes that Xi Jinping will naturally support keeping the strait open, since about 40% of China's oil imports have to pass through this waterway. This statement is quite a blow to Russia, which regards Iran as a strategic ally. In terms of strategic positioning, the two heads of state agreed to establish a constructive and strategically stable relationship between China and the US as the new framework for their bilateral ties, providing strategic guidance for the next 3 years and beyond. Xi Jinping expressed his hope that 2026 will become a historic and symbolic year for the continued development of China-US relations. On the Taiwan issue, Xi Jinping strongly opposed Taiwan independence during the talks, but Trump said he listened to Xi finish speaking without making any commitments. The US press release also did not include any statement about not supporting Taiwan independence, which left Beijing somewhat disappointed. For Russia, every outcome of the Xi-Trump meeting feels like a thorn in its side. On the issue of Iran's nuclear weapons, China sided with the US, made significant trade concessions to the US, and both sides jointly proposed a framework for stability. All of this suggests that a new kind of tacit understanding is being established between China and the US, and if this understanding extends to how the Russia-Ukraine war is handled, it could be disastrous for Moscow. So how could Putin not be anxious? Faced with this situation, the Kremlin's reaction can almost be described as restless. Kremlin spokesperson Peskov publicly stated that direct high-level talks between the world's first and second largest economies are a matter of special attention and in-depth analysis for all countries around the globe, including Russia. He went a step further, saying that Russia hopes to receive first-hand information about the China-US interactions after Putin arrives in Beijing. The phrase first-hand information, coming from the official spokesperson of a major country's presidential office, is quite telling. Diplomatic language is usually reserved and indirect, but Peskov is almost bluntly admitting that Russia doesn't know what was discussed between China and the US, and that Russia urgently needs to find out. This precisely reveals Putin's anxiety, especially since he didn't send someone else to Beijing but chose to go himself. As a former KGB agent, Putin believes that only by talking to Xi Jinping in person can he read the real situation from Xi's eyes. Of course, since the US sent Trump himself, Russia also needs Putin to show up in person to demonstrate sincerity. However, this is already Putin's 25th visit to China, while for Trump it's only his second visit, so rarity makes something more valuable. Obviously, Xi Jinping will place greater importance on Trump's visit to China. Wang Silayang, a scholar who studies Russian issues, analyzed that Russia has always attached great importance to historical experience. During the Cold War, changes in Sino-US relations once broke the original balance among major powers. Although today's international environment is different, Moscow still remains highly sensitive to strategic changes between China and the US. To put it bluntly, it's just that Trump's thinking is hard to predict. TASS's analysis also plainly stated that whenever there is significant interaction between top Chinese and US officials, the Russian side increases its frequency of communication with China. This has become a regular move by Russia over the past 2 years. Putin is an old fox from the KGB, and he brought 4 lists with him to Beijing to find out what's really going on. The real purpose behind Putin's visit is far more complicated than the official statements suggest. According to information obtained by the Epoch Times from within the Chinese Communist Party's diplomatic system, as well as internal intelligence cited by commentator Du Win on his social media program, Putin's visit to China centers around 4 core issues. The first item on the list, intelligence. What exactly did Trump say? The most urgent question Putin needs to figure out is whether, during Trump's time in Beijing, he asked Xi Jinping to reduce economic support for Russia, whether he made any specific demands regarding a ceasefire plan for the Russia-Ukraine war, and whether he obtained any form of endorsement from Beijing. Is there any implicit agreement between China and the US targeting Russia? According to Du Win, Putin's core logic is that as long as the US makes concessions to China on trade, technology, and the Taiwan issue, then the Chinese Communist Party might also be asked to make concessions on the Russia-Ukraine issue. Putin needs to go to Beijing in person to confirm face-to-face what kind of promises Xi Jinping actually made to Trump. The second item on the list is political endorsement to continue binding the China-Russia relationship. Putin's visit this time is meant to show the world a clear picture that China-Russia relationship has not been shaken by Trump's visit to China. This display, rather than being aimed at the West, is actually intended for the Russian public and countries in the global South. In Russian propaganda narratives, victories in major power diplomacy are one of the key pillars of the Putin regime's legitimacy. If Xi Jinping is seen as leaning toward the United States, then Putin will face cracks in his political narrative at home. The Figaro pointed out in its report that Putin's visit to China is deliberately meant to showcase the resilience of the Russia-China partnership, and this very display reveals Russia's anxiety over the easing of China-US relations. Du Wen analyzed on the program that the CCP's diplomatic strategy for 2026 can be summed up in one sentence: pro-America and Russia, cold toward Europe, and pressuring Japan. The CCP needs to ease tensions with the United States, but at the same time it will never give up Russia as a strategic rear just because it has resumed communication with the US. This is the essence of the China-Russia relationship. It's not about genuine affection, but rather that both sides need each other. The third list is about arrangements for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. The Russia-Ukraine battlefield has already fallen into a complicated stalemate. The Ukrainian side claims to have retaken about 400 square kilometers of land along several fronts, while Putin publicly declares that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is nearing its end. Both of these statements are laying the groundwork in advance for the post-ceasefire landscape. What Putin is really worried about isn't the ceasefire itself, but rather that the ceasefire plan will be led by the United States, with Europe participating in security guarantees, Ukraine receiving long-term military aid, and China tacitly accepting this framework from the sidelines. Du Wen's analysis points out that such an outcome would mean that although Russia gains some territory, it could be strategically locked in for the long term. Sanctions would not be lifted, assets would remain frozen, Europe would rearm, and Ukraine would become a permanent forward base for the West. What Putin fears most is exactly this kind of outcome, winning on the map but losing the future. That's why Putin needs Xi Jinping to give him a clear stance on several key issues. If there's a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, will the Chinese Communist Party be willing to recognize the security conditions proposed by Russia? Is China willing to participate in post-war reconstruction arrangements, such as in energy, infrastructure, or financial settlements? If the United States demands concessions from Russia, will China stand up for Russia diplomatically? If Europe continues to aid Ukraine, will China simultaneously increase its support for Russia? These are the core political issues at the heart of Putin's visit. He wants to make sure that China is not just a bystander, but continues to be the guarantor backing Russia politically and economically. The fourth item on the list is oil, the deal that's easiest to overlook. This is something Du Wen specifically emphasized on the show. It's the topic most likely to be ignored by outsiders, and it could also be the most substantial outcome of this visit. The root of the problem is that Ukraine's drones have been continuously striking Russian refineries, which has systematically weakened Russia's ability to produce refined oil products. According to a Reuters report on May 15th, from January to May this year, Ukrainian drones attacked 16 Russian refineries, resulting in a loss of refining capacity of about 700,000 barrels per day. In just the month of March alone, the primary refining units that were hit had a combined capacity of nearly 1 million barrels per day. Russia's not short on crude oil. It's one of the world's largest energy exporters, but crude oil has to be refined into products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel before it can be used. When refineries are bombed, it's like Russia has lost its own kitchen. They have plenty of ingredients, but can't cook a meal. China, on the other hand, is facing the exact opposite problem. According to internal reports from the Chinese Communist Party cited by Du Wen, in November 2025, Kai Chi once reported an important situation to Xi Jinping. China's demand for refined oil products had already peaked in 2025, and refining capacity was severely excessive, with a surplus as high as 253 million tons. If this excess capacity can't be absorbed, it will lead to factory shutdowns, equipment rusting and damage, and massive layoffs. But if the surplus capacity can be converted into exports, it could generate an annual increase of 1 trillion yuan in foreign trade exports. At the same time, China's own crude oil imports have also run into trouble. The U.S. crackdown on Venezuela and Iran has severely impacted the two cheap crude oil supply channels that China previously relied on. China even experienced shortages of refined oil products for a time, with electricity prices rising in many regions, especially in Guangdong, so a perfect complementary structure emerged. Russia exports crude oil, China refines it into finished oil products, and then some of it is sold back to Russia, or exchanged for cash flow. China and Russia are connected by land, and this two-way flow can be handled by oil pipelines, railways, and highways. It's expected that these transactions won't take the form of high-profile government procurement, but will instead quietly proceed through gray channels such as corporate contracts, border trade, third-country re-exports, and financial settlements in order to avoid secondary sanctions from the West. As Du Wen said, this is being neutral in words but placing bets in actions, publicly talking about peace while privately sending food supplies. This is a typical approach in Chinese Communist Party diplomacy. So, no matter who Xi Jinping sends to greet the plane, no matter how glamorous things look on the surface, behind the scenes, Xi might be trying to play both sides. Playing both sides between the US and Russia isn't without precedent in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, this is a deeply rooted survival strategy in the Chinese Communist Party's political tradition. The most classic historical example is the major pivot toward the US after the Sino-Soviet split during Mao Zedong's era. In the early 1960s, China and the Soviet Union broke off relations publicly, and Mao Zedong and Khrushchev were calling each other revisionists. On the surface, China and the Soviet Union were like fire and water, but Mao Zedong didn't completely turn to the West. He criticized both American imperialism and Soviet revisionism, claimed to be the standard-bearer of the Third World, and tried to maintain an independent strategic space between the two superpowers. By the 1970s, the situation shifted completely, and China and the US began secret contacts. In 1972, Nixon visited China, and Mao Zedong didn't hesitate to shake hands with his former number one enemy. The goal was to use the United States to counterbalance the Soviet Union. This major shift left the Soviet Union fearing a strategic squeeze from both sides and gave China an unprecedented amount of maneuvering room within the Cold War framework. Today, Xi Jinping's situation is, in a sense, a modern version of this logic, only the direction has been reversed. He first established a no-limits partnership with Russia, and now, under pressure from the United States, he's seeking to ease tensions with Washington, trying to position himself at the core of the new great power rivalry where both sides need him. Tactically, this might seem more sophisticated, but morally, it's even more hypocritical. It means that any commitment the Chinese Communist Party makes to either side is conditional and can be withdrawn at any time. Du Wen gave a precise description of this kind of relationship on the show. He said, the CCP doesn't necessarily truly like Russia, and Russia doesn't truly like the CCP either. The CCP doesn't genuinely trust Russia, but both sides need each other. Russia needs China to buy its energy, give it diplomatic space, and provide it with an economic backdoor. This isn't friendship, it's a marriage of convenience based on interests. As for Xi Jinping, his current calculation is to make the United States believe that China is willing to cooperate, while at the same time making Russia believe that China won't abandon it. He wants Europe's attention to remain tied up on the Russia-Ukraine battlefield so they have no time to deal with the CCP, keeping himself in a pivotal position where all sides feel the need to win him over. This kind of multi-directional strategic opportunism might work in the short term, but the price is ultimately losing the trust of all countries. If things go wrong, it could end up making you the target of everyone's criticism. On the very same day that Putin set foot in Beijing, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the start of a 3-day nuclear weapons drill, with thousands of soldiers participating in exercises across the country. The timing of this move is as obvious as Sima Zhao's intentions. Everyone can see what's going on. By showcasing its nuclear capabilities at the same time as Putin's visit to China, this sends at least 2 clear signals. To Trump, it's a reminder to Washington that Russia still holds enough ultimate leverage. A constructive and strategically stable relationship between China and the US can't bypass Russia. To Xi Jinping, it's a way of showing Russia's trump card, emphasizing that Putin is not a dialogue partner who can be easily marginalized. The nuclear exercise itself might just be a routine military operation, but announcing it at such a sensitive moment means it's no longer just a military move. It becomes a diplomatic message, a form of deterrent reminder. If you strip away all the surface-level talk of friendship and goodwill, at its core, it's really Putin and Xi Jinping relying on each other as they each face their own difficulties. Russia's predicament is that it hasn't achieved a quick victory on the battlefield, its refineries have been bombed to pieces, and the sanctions and blockades are getting tighter and tighter. If China and the US were ever to truly draw closer, Russia would lose its strategic backyard. Putin has to come in person to make sure that lifeline is still there. The Chinese Communist Party's predicament is a slowing economy, disruptions in crude oil supply, and although relations with the US have somewhat eased, they could reverse at any moment. They need to keep the Russia card on the table as bargaining leverage. Xi Jinping has to make Putin feel that the China-Russia relationship is unbreakable, while at the same time making Trump believe that China and the US are working together constructively. As Du Wen summed up, Putin didn't come to Beijing this time to celebrate friendship, but to make sure Russia's lifeline is still intact. This lifeline includes political, diplomatic, and wartime lifelines, as well as an energy lifeline. This kind of collusion, a strategic mutual guarantee based on self-interest, may work in the short term, but it has deep-seated internal contradictions. The deep-seated mistrust between China and Russia has never truly disappeared, from the Sino-Soviet split to today. When there's a fundamental shift in the situation or a fundamental conflict of interests, these partners, who don't trust each other but still depend on one another, could go their separate ways at any moment. Xi Jinping may really be playing both sides, but history tells us that anyone who tries to ride 2 horses at once will eventually have to choose a side. And what will Putin's fate be? This Thursday, I'll be releasing an episode of Mysteries of Time, where I'll share with you the fate of Russia and Putin as seen by a psychic. In it, I mentioned that a fourth invisible force will provoke a war between the eagle, the dragon, and the bear. Everyone knows which countries the eagle, the dragon, and the bear represent. Looking at the world today, it really does feel like a modern-day Three Kingdoms saga is playing out. If you're interested in this topic, don't forget to check out Thursday's episode of Mysteries of Time.